I'm going to spend the next few minutes sharing with you some of the work that Miner has been doing in collaboration with Dr. Dave Barbano at Cornell. And the area that we're really focusing on is how we can use milk analysis technologies to monitor management and improve herd performance in a way that we haven't done before. We're probably all very familiar with this small little milk vial. It's used worldwide to measure fat, protein, and lactose for payment testing. And on an individual cow basis, it's used in many of our dairy herd management programs. And over the last couple of years, my view of the usefulness of this vial has really changed, and there's a lot more information that we can be getting, in particular from our bulk tank samples. That really led us to work that we've been doing in collaboration with Cornell and the St. Albans Cooperative Creamery in Vermont. And the creamery really had a goal of wanting to figure out a way that could help their producers increase components. And this was going to be beneficial from an economic standpoint for the farmers, as well as beneficial for the creamery. And what we have been doing is developing new tools in milk analysis focused on the bulk tank that really takes advantage of the mid-infrared technology that's available for milk analysis. And this information then allows us to support decision-making in regards to feeding and general management of the herd. In this particular project, we're working with Delta Instruments, which is one of the big three milk analysis instrument manufacturers. And the models that I'm going to share with you today really have been driven and are currently available on the Delta instrumentation. So basically, we've been working on bulk tank, but we've also developed some tools for individual cows. However, today the focus is really going to be on the tools for bulk tank, and in particular the milk fatty acid metrics. And very exciting for us was a year ago, February, that the St. Albans Cooperative it was the first co-op in the nation to adopt fatty acid analysis and provide results to farmers on a daily basis. And what this really means is that on a regular basis, daily for most farms, that they're going to get a bulk tank report that's going to have the components that they're used to seeing, butter, fat, protein, lactose, and so on. But they're also going to have some new information provided, and that's the fatty acid metrics that I referred to. And they're noted here in the red circle as de novo fatty acids, mixed fatty acids, and preformed fatty acids, and they're expressed in grams per 100 grams of milk. The fourth column that's in that red circle is double bonds, and this refers to an unsaturation index. It's the amount of double bonds on average that occur in a fatty acid. And I'll explain more about what these fatty acids mean in a moment. But really, when I've talked to some producers, especially when they first started receiving this information, they really ask the question, what is this and what can I do with it? And I want to spend the next couple of moments just giving you some background information about milk fat and fatty acids, and then I'll go into how we can actually use this information on farm to make decisions. Milk fat tends to be one of the most variable components of milk, more so than fat, more so than protein or lactose, really any other component. The milk fat is composed of about 98% triglycerides, and you can see here the chemical structure for milk fat. It's 3 fatty acids shown by these squiggly lines attached to a glycerol backbone. And what's kind of interesting about milk, there's more than 400 fatty acids that can be found in milk. But really, if we look at the majority of the milk fat, it's going to be composed of about 20 fatty acids. And we can broadly group these fatty acids into 3 broad categories. Those categories are de novo fatty acids, mixed origin fatty acids, and preformed fatty acids. And we group them based on where they're coming from. The de novo fatty acids are our shorter chain fatty acids, 4 carbons to 14 carbons in length, and they're made in the mammary gland. And they're going to be highly influenced by ruminal fermentation and the amount of biohydrogenation that's occurring in that rumen. And so we can use these as an index of how well the rumen is functioning. Another group is the preformed fatty acids, and these are going to be coming from either from the diet or they're going to be mobilized from body fat mobilization. And these are our longer chain fatty acids, usually greater than 18 carbons. And then, as you can see in the diagram, there's some fatty acids that come from multiple sources, and these we refer to as the mixed origin fatty acids, or C16 fatty acids. And they can come from the fat in the diet, similar to the preformed fatty acid group, or they can be made in the mammary gland, similar to the de novo fatty acids. In general, the de novo fatty acids are going to make up less than about a third of the total fatty acids in the milk, whereas the mixed origin and the preformed fatty acids are going to make up more than a third of the milk fat each. Now, if we use the example herd that the bulk tank has a fat content of 4.1 and try to relate this to what this means from a preformed, mixed, and de novo standpoint, we see that the milk fat is going to be composed of about 95% fatty acids and about 5% glycerol. Of those fatty acids, a portion is going to be preformed, another portion is going to be mixed, and a smaller portion will be the de novo fatty acids. Now, why do we care about this information? Well, over the last year or so, we looked and monitored over 400 dairy farms in the St. Albans Co-op, and what we did was look at the relationship to milk fat and milk protein, and we saw that these fatty acid groups, in particular the de novo fatty acids and the mixed fatty acids, have a positive relationship with fat. So essentially, milk fat and protein increase when de novo fatty acids along with mixed fatty acids increase. And although the example I'm showing here is for Holstein farms, it occurs for both Holstein, mixed breed, and Jersey herds. So we wanted to understand better what explained this variation in milk fat and milk protein and these fatty acid groups within farms. So we went about conducting some farm visits in 2014 and 15 to better understand management and nutrition differences between herds that have high de novo fatty acids and low fatty acids, and that's designated by the high and low in this table. And as you can see, in 2014, this was a group of animals that included 40 farms that had Holsteins, Jerseys, or many of the farms had mixed breeds. And you can see that there's a large fat difference of about 4.6 versus 3.9 between the high and low herds. And along with that, we see differences in protein, de novo, mixed, and preformed. To try to eliminate some of the yield differences or breed effects in that 2014 study, we repeated the approach in 2015 using all Holstein herds with a little higher milk production. And again, we saw that groups of farms that had high de novo fatty acids, 0.9 in this case, versus farms with low de novo, 0.8, those high farms had higher fat and higher protein. And when we visited the farms, we collected lots of information about what they were feeding the cows, as well as how they were managing those animals. And what became apparent is that stocking density definitely has a large influence. And in this particular case, high de novo herds with the higher fat and protein, they tended to be 10 times more likely to provide over 18 inches of bunk space per cow, as well as they were more likely to stock the stalls at less than 110%. So just some additional reasons why, when you're thinking about what is the optimal level of stocking density, we know it's going to affect the daily time budget of the cow, but now we also realize it's going to affect milk composition. In particular, it's going to have an impact on the amount of de novo and mixed fatty acids that are contributing to the milk fat. It's just not the management that is having an impact on high and low de novo herds, it's also the feed availability. And what we saw in this particular study, or the surveys, was that high de novo herds feed more frequently, 2 times per day compared to once a day. They also make sure the diet contains sufficient physically effective fiber, with those high de novo herds feeding over 21% PNDF. The other thing that we know is that the content of fat can have an impact on the amount of milk fat that's produced. In high de novo herds, they typically fed lower fat diets. Now, these diets, on average, were less than 3.5%, which by most standards is fairly low. But what we're realizing is not just the total amount of fat, but the makeup of that fat, or the fatty acids in the diet and that go into the rumen, and they're going to have an impact. And so we're doing more work trying to understand the impact of rumen unsaturated fatty acid load, or RUFL. Now, hopefully I've just given you a quick snapshot that basically we can look at relationships between fatty acid groups in milk that we can now measure with these new tools, and its relationship with fat, and protein. And there's some management and dietary things that can have an impact. And so that information is being reported to the farmers, and the real question becomes then, how should we use this information once we receive it? And for farmers that are receiving it for the first time, or for consultants that are working with the farm, or they're going to use it as a snapshot, try to understand where is the herd relative to other herds, or what is the opportunity within that herd. It can also be used in a troubleshooting mode for herds that are been tracking this information for a period of time. Now, to start looking at it from a snapshot or a troubleshooting standpoint, I think it makes sense to think about bulk tank alarms, and in this case I'm going to use examples for Holstein herds. And these alarms may change based on the farm goals, but I think for a first look this is a good place to start. So for Holstein herds, we should be able to achieve a fat percentage over 3.8 on the bulk tank. And if we're not, then there's probably some opportunity on that farm, and we start to look at the makeup of that fat. And for de novo fatty acids, and these are all expressed in grams per 100 grams of milk, we get concerned when the value is less than 0.8 for de novo. For mixed, we're concerned when it's less than 1.3, and for preformed, we're concerned when it's less than 1.3. We can also look at the fatty acid unsaturation index, and again, this is expressed as double bonds per fatty acid. And unlike the other ones where low numbers are bad, this one is we're concerned when the number increases, in particular when it's greater than 0.31. Now I can take some data from the St. Albans Co-op, and I've graphed it here, and if we use those alarm levels showing the horizontal line at 3.8% fat and the vertical line at 0.8 grams per 100 grams for de novo, we can divide this data into different quadrants. And in the upper right-hand quadrant, if the farm falls there during the snapshot approach, we say, keep up the good work. It looks like things are working well, the rumen is functioning, and this is where most farms want to be. There are some situations where farms can have very nice levels of fat in the bulk tank, but maybe the contribution of the fat that's making that up, maybe there's an opportunity. In this particular case, the de novo fatty acids are low, and in most cases we want to maximize the contribution of de novo fatty acids to milk fat. So in this particular situation, we look at, are there problems with rumen function? Is there something with the diet? Maybe the farm is feeding a lot of fat, especially some of the bypass fats that allow, like palmitic, allow us to maintain or achieve high levels of fat. A higher proportion comes from mixed and preformed sources. Also, our management can have an impact, and we consider things such as, are the cows overstocked, and is that having a negative impact on the rumen function through changes in time budgets? There are some farms that basically achieve a lower level of milk fat than what we'd like them to see, although they do have good rumen function. In this particular case, it may be a time to consider feeding some rumen inert fat, or potentially the cows are thin for various reasons and the contribution of preformed fatty acids to milk fat is low. The quadrant that we probably have the most opportunity to improve is going to be this one, where we have low fat and we have low de novo fatty acids. And usually our field experience will start to look and ask, is there too much fat, or in particular the rumen unsaturated acid load, is it too high? Is there too much starch or other fermentable carbohydrates? What is the physical form of the diet, and is that sufficient to support a healthy rumen? We'll also take a look at some of the management factors that are affecting feeding behavior in particular. I just want to share with you one example from a farm in Vermont that was in that lower left-hand quadrant, and on their snapshot they were having fat in the range of 3.4 to 3.5% fat. And you can see the de novo fatty acids were well below the alarm level of 0.8. The mixed fatty acids were below that alarm level of 1.3. And the preformed were right where we would kind of expect them to be for a herd with this level of performance. And what was alarming to us was that the unsaturation index was at 0.35, which is much higher than the 0.131 where we get concerned about milk fat depression. And so really, as we started to look at the nutritionist started to look at the diet and some management activities, it became apparent that the diet was too high in rumen unsaturated fatty acid load. And so in this particular case, the farm was using homegrown roasted soybeans and grinding them extremely fine with a hammer mill. The solution to try to increase milk fat, because there's probably too much release of fatty acids in the rumen, was to increase the grind size. And these new milk metrics gave the farm some reason or some motivation to think of why they should make a change and invest in buying some different screen sizes. And what they found was basically in a very short period of time, they were able to increase their milk fat over 3.7%. And de novo rumen function, that value has increased along with mixed and preformed. There's still some opportunity, though, for improvement with the amount of contributions of mixed fatty acids to the total milk fat, as well as decreasing double bonds. And the farm is continuing to increase the grind size of the soybean, trying to figure out where they can optimize milk components and milk yield at the same time. Now, not all farms are this easy to troubleshoot a milk fat depression. We know that basically this picture reminds me of the tangled mess that sometimes we face when trying to figure out what is causing milk fat depression. And in our experience working with herds over the last year or two, and based on research information, we really know that some of the key factors are the amount of fat that's in the diet and the amount of rumen unsaturated fatty acid load in particular, with a goal of trying to keep that maybe under 600 to 700 grams depending on the intake level of the cows in the herd. Management, the key one that comes up in the work that we've done, as well as some more controlled research, is stocking density, and that's a big one, especially here in the Northeast. And then from a fermentable carbohydrate standpoint, these can be a risk factor as well. So are we feeding the appropriate amount of starch? What is the digestibility of the starch and the fiber? And then balancing that with the physical form of that forage or fiber. And then in certain situations, yeast and molds can have an impact as well. So one of the things that we've been doing is not all farms currently have access to these milk metrics. Right now it's just the St. Albans Co-op, and in the next couple of months my understanding is Agrimark will be joining the St. Albans Co-op with being able to provide this information back to farms. But in the short term, we've been working with herds across the U.S., not just here in the Northeast, to make sure these relationships hold true. And so we've been basically taking bulk tank samples in a snapshot approach for a week to a week and a half on farms, and then analyzing and then trying to understand where are the opportunities, either from a nutrition or management standpoint. And here I'm just sharing with you an example from a Holstein herd that's producing over 90 pounds of milk. And when we get results, we looked at it in August, and we did it again just in a couple months ago in January. The first thing we do is talk with the nutritionist or the farmers. All right, how is milk production? Is it where you think it should be relative to the genetics and the management ability of the farm? In this case, we look at lactose, and in this farm, it's very good. They're having excellent milk production. But where we see an opportunity is in their milk fat, and they have lower milk fat than what the farm goal would be, and at least during the summer months, kind of classical milk fat depression. So there's definitely an opportunity. The next thing we do is look at milk protein, because that gives us an indication of how the rumen is functioning as well. And so in this case, over 3, so probably good rumen fermentation, good production of rumen microbial biomass. So we're having nice amino acid flow to the small intestine and utilization for milk protein. Now, if we come back to the fat, we can think about, okay, why is the fat low? And if we look at the individual fatty acid groups, we can start to understand, okay, where's an opportunity to potentially make some changes to improve overall milk fat? In this case, for both months, the de novo fatty acids were lower than that 0.8. And so it indicates that there's definitely an opportunity to improve de novo synthesis. And this really relates back to what can we do to improve potentially rumen function that's going to affect the outflow of certain fatty acids intermediates that we know based on controlled research are going to affect the ability of the mammary gland to make those fatty acids. Mixed in this particular case is low in both, and again, pointing towards a de novo synthesis issue. This farm did see an improvement in the mixed fatty acids, and in part this is probably due to some changes in the dietary fat feeding strategy. The preformed fatty acids in this farm was around 1.3, 1.4, and that's to be expected and right where we want them to be for a herd of this production level. Again, the unsaturation index supported what we were seeing with the de novo fatty acids in that there's probably opportunity to improve rumen function that's going to have an impact, and the unsaturation index points us to potentially an issue with rumen unsaturated fatty acid load. So there's several things that a farm like this can start to evaluate. One is when we're looking at the bulk tank, there's some variation from day to day in their sampling, and so maybe there's some time budget things that are occurring in the cows that's changing, that's affecting either timing of milking or access to feed availability and so forth that can be explored, as well as there's some additional dietary factors. And one that seems to be quite prevalent here in the Northeast is the use of high levels of corn silage. And although we don't think of corn silage as a feed that contributes a lot of fat because it has a low fat content, we feed an awful lot of it, and actually the total grams that are contributed towards that RUFL number is fairly large. And so we're taking a look at especially farms that feed corn silage, distillers grains, bakery products, roasted soybeans, those type of feedstuffs that contribute a lot of fatty acids, and especially the co-products that potentially can be variable that maybe at times are contributing some of this low fat issues to farms. Now, I've hopefully just given you a couple ideas how we can use this information from a snapshot standpoint. Now I want to move on, and I think the real value of using this information is evaluating changes over time. Here I've just listed the 3 fatty acid groups and what we think about when they either increase or decrease over time. For de novo fatty acids, when we see an increase in the bulk tank, we know that there's been a positive impact of something on milk fat and protein. The response is typically due to improved rumen function and or maybe feed quality. For mixed fatty acids, when we see increases in the bulk tank, it's oftentimes in response to increased dietary fat, but it can also be in response to increased de novo synthesis that can be also related to rumen function. For both de novo and mixed, when we see a decrease in them, we basically want to make sure that we stop and evaluate management and nutrition. And did something change? Was it an unexpected change, or was it a planned change that maybe didn't go the way that we expected? For preformed fatty acids, when we see an increase in the bulk tank, this might be in response to more body fat mobilization. And if this is the case, this could be a concern, especially if cows start to lose too much body condition and end up being thin, and that may lead to some performance issues, especially in regards to reproductive performance down the road. Preform can also increase in response to dietary fat. When we see decreases in preformed fatty acid, often the herd body condition score might be too low. Maybe they've already mobilized a large percentage of their body fat, and so there really isn't much more that can be contributed to that milk. Milk fat oftentimes decreases long term when preform starts to decrease, and it in general indicates that there's a herd body condition score issue. Now, one of the things I think is important to know is the farm's variation so that we can understand changes over time. And here's just an example farm where I've listed out the mean for the fat and the different fatty acid groups and the standard deviation for a 13-month period, as well as given that if you're doing this across farms, maybe coefficient of variation is a better way at looking at this variation because there are differences in the means. And so this allows one to account for that difference in mean by dividing the standard deviation by the mean. And so we're seeing values typically in the field of 2 to 3% variation for these items. Just want to illustrate this concept a little bit further. Here we take fat from a farm during the month of November, and we can look at the mean of that fat. And if I'd use the variation that I have over the past year and look at plus or minus 2 standard deviations, we can see that the fat kind of falls within that. And this is a control process chart approach that many manufacturing facilities would use to, let's say, if they are building nuts and they wanted the weight of the nut to be a consistent amount, that if it falls out, there's maybe something broken in their manufacturing process. We can use this same kind of concept to see if something changed or is broken within our dairy systems. So if we take an example farm and look at variation in November, and we look at the means of de novo mixed and preformed fatty acids, we can see that there's variation around the mean. But I'm just going to use the example of preformed and that mean plus or minus 2 standard deviations. And what we can see is that towards the end of November, that something changed on this farm. This was a farm I was tracking, and all of a sudden I saw this and I thought, what happened? And essentially what became clear was that, talking with the farm manager, that they had made a change to increase the amount of BMR corn silage in the diet significantly compared to what it was, along with a grain change that allowed that diet to be better formulated. And so was telling us that there was in this case, a change that affected milk fat. And what was interesting is that if we look back just at the fat in general for that bulk tank, we couldn't have picked up that there was some meaningful nutritional change occurring on that farm, yet these fatty acid metrics allowed us to see that variation. Another thing that we can do is look at changes in forage quality, and here shown in the purple line is fat over the May-June month for a herd, and then we see the fatty acid groups. And what was interesting to note is towards the middle to end of June, that all of a sudden the preformed and mixed fatty acids as a proportion of their contribution to the total fat changed. And we see that the preformed fatty acids increased. And this was quite alarming when I saw this, because this is not a direction typically we want our bulk tank to change, because it indicates the cows are probably mobilizing, in this particular case, especially with no diet change, or mobilizing more body condition score. In this case, it showed up in the bulk tank quicker than what our feed analysis had showed. We hadn't taken a sample of corn silage quick enough, and the corn silage quality from a digestibility as well as starch content changed. Cows were maintaining their pounds of milk production, but the composition of the fat was changing, and this allowed us to make a dietary change quicker than what we might have otherwise done. One of the things when you're comparing variation between or within herds that we have to keep in mind is there's many things that can affect it. And as we've been talking through these examples, feeding, housing, and just the milking of cows can have an impact. And I showed you some examples how diet and feed quality can have an impact. The other thing we need to think about is consistency within the day-to-day routine. And anything that affects the time budget of a cow is potentially going to affect the variation in the bulk tank sample. One of the classic examples is days off and vacations. And we have a farm that we're working with in Texas that basically didn't understand why their tanker loads of milk varied so much from milking shift to milking shift. And what they found was that basically feed wasn't being pushed up in the late evening hours on certain days. And that was just a function of lack of having enough employees to get all the jobs done, and basically had an impact on the variability within their bulk tank and the milk composition. Weather changes, and particularly heat stress, can have an impact in how tanks are filled. There is a time of day effect on milk composition, and so that will show up in tanks depending on how those tanks are being filled. One of the key things that we want to look at with changes over time is those herds that are in the upper right-hand quadrant, that everything is going well. What happens if things start changing gradually and we're headed towards that bottom left-hand quadrant? Basically, a gradual change in milk fat happens in most situations. What we will see is that there's an increase in the unsaturation index, followed by a decrease in mixed fatty acids, and then a continued decrease in mixed fatty acids and a decrease in de novo fatty acids unless something has changed. And if this situation goes on long enough, it's going to have an impact on the protein rumen function and ultimately decrease true protein. And so here's just an example showing the herd with decreasing milk fat. And so the fat is gradually decreasing. This is over a couple-week period. And we see right away that there's an increase in unsaturation in that. And we get concerned as that creeps above 0.13. And with those increase in unsaturation, we see first a change in the mixed fatty acids with a decrease, followed by a decrease in de novo fatty acids. And so once we identify that these things are moving in the direction of milk fat depression, we want to put in recovery diets or make management changes that are going to help that improve. And we can tell if those are having a benefit or not, because we'll start to see then an increase in mixed fatty acids first, then followed by a continued increase in mixed fatty acids, and then an increase in the de novo fatty acids. And when this happens, one of the things we monitor is milk yield, and we don't expect typically to see a change there, but we should see an increase in total milk fat. The other thing is that we need to be realistic about the time it takes for milk fat to recover. And sometimes based on what we're seeing in the field as well as controlled research from Penn State, it can take 10 days or more, sometimes 2 to 3 weeks for the fat to totally recover. The last couple things I want to mention is some other variation as you're interpreting changes over time, is that just like we know that fat and protein content changes with the season, so do the fatty acid groups. And following the fat content, de novo fatty acids will decrease during the spring and summer months and then increase in the fall. Mixed fatty acid group also follows that same format, where preformed has a little bit different change. We also know that if a herd is changing in days in milk, given how milk composition changes across a lactation cycle, that's going to have an impact as well. So, for example, in early lactation, we see high fat, and it usually reaches a low point in 2 to 3 months after calving and then gradually increases throughout lactation. We see that similar pattern for the preformed fatty acid group, as well as de novo, but not quite to the extent. And so we have to keep these things in mind as we move through days in milk adjust on a farm. And this is in particular if you have a herd that is seasonal calving or has large calving events at one time, and that can really influence the days in milk and the composition of the bulk tank. So to just wrap up, I want to leave you with a couple take-home messages. The bulk tank fatty acid metrics are currently available for St. Albans Co-op, and we are, through Cornell's lab and our lab, doing some testing of farms throughout the U.S. to try to help them use a snapshot approach and troubleshoot some issues. And where we're seeing is that farmers, along with their nutrition consultants, are using this information to make nutrition and management decisions. In particular, we see there's 2 different ways that farms currently are using this information. They're using a herd snapshot approach and using it for troubleshooting and looking at the response to a particular management or feeding change that's been made. And we see the biggest opportunity here for herds that are experiencing milk fat depression. And then the second way that we can use this information is evaluating changes over time, and we can look at planned and unexpected events. So today I focused primarily on just the bulk tank information, but we are doing a lot of work looking at milk analysis tools for individual cows, and currently we have some tools for the fresh cow that's focused on energy, balance, and health, and we continue to work on this area, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to share more of that with you. So thanks for your attention, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer those.
Is St. Albans Creamery, are they providing this information routinely? Do the farmers have to request it? Is there a cost involved in it?
No, so it's a great question. So starting February of 2016, the co-op started providing this information back to the farmer at no additional cost and on a routine basis, typically daily for most farms, right when they're sending the bulk tank results through an email, or a farmer can log in and get that information electronically, or a consultant that's working with the farm. And so it's been a nice tool that some farms are seeing benefit from, as well as the co-op long-term hopes to see benefit from, because the co-op hopes to help farmers increase fat and protein yields, component yields on their farm, and that ultimately helps the co-op as well.
Okay. And then another question, somebody asked that same question, but also there's another question here that says, is there a connection between de novo fatty acids and milk protein?
Yes, definitely. So one of the things that we see, and at first we were kind of surprised, is there's a positive relationship. So if we look at the bottom graph here, we can see that the de novo fatty acids, when they increase, that we see more milk protein. And at first, I think when Dave Barbanos first saw this relationship, he kind of wondered why. But as we think about when we have a healthy rumen, and that's usually when we're going to have higher levels of de novo fatty acid synthesis, that basically then there's a nice combination of carbohydrate and nitrogen supply for the rumen microbes. In that case, they're going to grow well, and then we're going to have nice yields of microbial protein. And microbial protein is the best amino acid source for the cow to make milk protein. And so we do see a nice relationship between the de novo fatty acids and milk protein.
Okay, and then the last question I have here is, how does feeding 1.5 pounds of palm fat affect the fatty acid composition?
Sure, great question. So that's going to contribute to the total fat, and that palm fat, typically the palmitic fatty acids I think they're referring to, is a C16. And when we feed that, we see higher levels of mixed fatty acids. And so that can result in increased milk fat overall, or it can increase the proportion of the mixed fatty acids contributing to total fat. And so herds that feed a lot of those types of feed stuffs will see a higher proportion of that fat coming from the mixed form.
Okay. Did they see any correlation between somatic cell counts and the profile of FA?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one that we haven't looked too closely at. Currently, we're looking at some measures of somatic cell count and other immune markers for individual cows. So I'll have to take a closer look at that one on a bulk tank basis, but thank you for the question.
All right, and is there a fatty acid group figure that tells us about body condition loss?
Yeah, so the one that I focus on most often when I'm thinking about body condition is the preformed fatty acids. So typically we're going to see herds that might be around 1.3 to maybe 1.4. Kind of depends on their performance level. But when I see a change in preformed, if all of a sudden I haven't made any plan changes on the farm and preformed fatty acids go up, that makes me think that cows are mobilizing more body condition. And so depending on where your herd is at, that could be a good or it could be a bad thing. It could maybe indicate you have more fresh cows contributing to the bulk tank as well. When I see preformed go down, then that may be just a point that if I start to look, if it's a herd I'm not familiar with, is this a skinny herd? Maybe they've already mobilized their stores of fat. So yeah, that's one of the three groups that we can really focus on body condition is the preformed fatty acids.
Okay, Heather, that's all the questions that we have this afternoon. So I want to thank you for a really excellent presentation, really well done. Thanks all you folks for joining us today. And again, Heather, thank you very, very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to join us.